The courtroom hummed with routine chatter as 10-year-old Malik Jackson faced Judge Evelyn Carter, Atlanta's toughest juvenile arbiter, her black skin gleaming under fluorescent lights. His latest foster parents, the rich white Donovans, aimed to ditch him after 6 months, another discard in his jagged life. Everyone braced for a quick handover. Then Malik's shaky voice pierced the air. "You're my mum." Gasps exploded. Evelyn's gavel clattered. A crumpled photo tumbled from his grip, whispering secrets she'd entombed. What truth could unravel her iron world? Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. And if you stand for justice against all odds, hit that like button and subscribe, because tomorrow's wild episode is one you won't want to miss. The courtroom's stunned silence shattered into a roar of murmurs as Judge Evelyn Carter stumbled from her bench, the echo of Malik Jackson's words searing her skull like a branding iron. 10 years old, all wiry limbs and haunted eyes, he stood clutching the edge of the witness table, his oversized grey hoodie swallowing his frame. The Donovans, Philip and Margaret, sat rigid in their tailored suits, faces paling beneath their Botox-smooth skin as the gallery buzzed. Evelyn snatched the fallen gavel, slamming it twice, her voice a steel whip. "Order now!" The room hushed, but the air crackled with unspoken questions. She adjourned the session in a blur, her robes swirling as she fled to her chambers, the faded photograph Malik had dropped burning a hole in her clenched fist. Inside, she locked the door, her breath jagged, and sank into the leather chair behind her oak desk. The photo trembled in her grip, a Polaroid so worn its edges curled like dying leaves. There she was, 15 years younger, swollen with pregnancy, smiling in a hospital gown under Mercy Grace Hospital's sterile lights. Her heart thudded, a drumbeat of dread and impossible hope. 15 years ago, she'd lain in that same hospital, 32 weeks pregnant, her husband Darius pacing beside her. A sudden bleed, a rush of doctors, then darkness. When she woke, they'd handed her a death certificate for her son, a boy she'd named Isaiah, stillborn, they said. She'd never seen his body, never held him, the grief a jagged blade that carved her into the relentless judge she'd become. But now Malik's eyes, dark and piercing like Darius's, stared back at her from the courtroom, and this photo, this impossible relic, whispered a truth she couldn't grasp. She pressed her palms to her temples, willing her mind to steady. Malik's file sat on her desk, a thick stack of failures chronicling his 10 years in foster care. 8 homes, all white families, each one spitting him out with the same tired labels. Uncooperative, disruptive, troubled. The Donovans, a power couple who owned half of Atlanta's luxury condos, were just the latest, their petition to relinquish. Custody dripping with disdain. "Unmanageable," Margaret had written in her crisp cursive, "a poor fit for our household." Evelyn's stomach twisted. She'd seen this script too many times, black kids chewed up and spat out by a system that saw them as burdens, not children. But Malik's claim wasn't just another foster kid's cry for attention. It was personal, a dagger aimed at her core. The door rattled with a knock, sharp and insistent. Karen Price, Malik's social worker, slipped in, her graying bun tight. Has her pinched expression. 50-something with a voice gravelly from too many cigarettes, she'd been in the game 20 years, her empathy long eroded. "Judge Carter, we need to talk about the boy," she said, dropping a manila folder onto the desk. "He's spinning stories again. Trauma does that, you know. 8 homes in 10 years, it scrambles their heads." Evelyn's jaw tightened, her fingers curling around the photo. "He's not scrambled, Karen, he's specific. And this," she thrust the Polaroid forward, "this isn't a delusion." Karen squinted at it, her lips pursing into a thin line. "Coincidence? Kids cling to anything that gives them hope. You're a public figure. He's seen your face somewhere, built a fantasy." Evelyn's pulse quickened, rage simmering beneath her calm. "A fantasy with my pregnant belly in his hands? I'm ordering a DNA test, expedited. Private, today." Karen's eyebrows shot up, but she didn't argue, just shrugged, her apathy a wall Evelyn couldn't breach. "You're cool, Judge. But the Donovans won't like it. They're already on the phone with their lawyer, screaming about defamation." Evelyn stood towering over the desk, her voice low and lethal. "Let them scream. I want that test done by tomorrow." Karen nodded, retreating with a sigh, leaving Evelyn alone with the photo and a storm of doubt. By dusk, the courthouse steps swarmed with chaos. Word of Malik's claim had leaked, and Victor Hale, a sleazy reporter with a penchant for racist, dog whistles stood at the center, microphone in hand. His blonde hair gleamed under camera lights, his smirk sharp as he spoke to a local news crew. Judge Evelyn Carter, Atlanta's so-called champion of justice, now faces a wild accusation from a problem kid with a rap sheet longer than his arm. Is this a breakdown or just another race card play? Behind him, a crowd swelled, mostly white faces twisted with anger, clutching signs scrawled with venom. "Black judges can't be trusted and send her back to the ghetto." Evelyn watched from her chamber window, her fists balled, the sting of their slurs a familiar wound. Reopened. She'd clawed her way up from a shotgun house in Bankhead to this bench, and still they saw her as less than human. The Donovans emerged from the courthouse, Philip's arm around Margaret's waist, their faces a mask of practiced indignation. A reporter shoved a mic at them, and Margaret's voice dripped with rehearsed sorrow. "That boy's troubled. We tried to help, but this lie, it's outrageous. We're law-abiding citizens, not villains." Philip nodded, his silver tie pin glinting as he added, "Judge Carter's letting emotion cloud her judgment. We'll fight this nonsense." The crowd cheered, a roar of approval that made Evelyn's skin crawl. She turned from the window, her resolve hardening. If Malik was hers, she'd burn the world down to prove it. Back in her chambers, she dialed Marcus Tate, a private investigator she'd used before, his voice a gravelly comfort when he picked up. "Evelyn, what's this mess I'm hearing about?" She didn't waste time. "Marcus, I need you to dig into Mercy Grace Hospital 15 years back. My son, Isaiah, stillborn, they said. I don't believe it anymore. Start with the staff, anyone who might talk." He paused, then grunted assent. "Risky move, but I'm on it. Watch your back, though. This city's itching to eat you alive." She hung up, her eyes drifting to the photo. The Donovan's lawyer, some hotshot named Gerald Finch, had already filed a motion to suppress Malik's claim, calling it baseless harassment. She'd fight that tomorrow, but tonight she needed answers. Outside, the protest grew uglier. A brick sailed through, the air smashing a courthouse window, glass raining onto the marble steps. Voices chanted, "No black justice, and lock her up." Evelyn grabbed her coat, slipping out a side exit, but the mob spotted her. A man in a red cap lunged, spitting in her face, the warm saliva dripping down her cheek as he snarled, "You don't belong here, girl." She wiped it off, her glare cutting through him, and shoved past, her heels clicking on the pavement. 2 blocks away, her car waited, a sleek black sedan she'd earned through years of grit. She climbed in, started the engine, and froze. The hood erupted in flames, a Molotov cocktail's fiery bloom lighting the night. She dove out, rolling onto the asphalt as the blaze consumed her escape, the crowd's cheers a sickening soundtrack. She staggered to her feet, coughing through smoke, her phone buzzing with a text from an unknown number. "Drop it or the kid's next." Her blood ran cold. Malik was still at the courthouse under Karen's watch, waiting for a temporary placement. She sprinted back, shoving through the thinning mob, her heart pounding a brutal rhythm. Inside, she found him in a holding room, curled on a bench, his knees to his chest. "Malik," she whispered, kneeling beside him. He looked up, eyes wide with trust she hadn't earned yet. "Are you really my mom?" She swallowed, the photo heavy in her pocket. "I don't know, but I'm going to find out." Karen bustled. In, clipboard in hand, her tone clipped. "Judge, we're moving him tonight. Group home, standard procedure." Evelyn stood, blocking her path. "No. He stays with me until the test results come back. Emergency custody, I'll file it now." Karen's mouth opened, then shut, her reluctance palpable. "The Donovans won't stand for this." Evelyn's voice dropped to a growl. "I don't care what they stand for, he's not going anywhere." She pulled Malik close, his small hand gripping hers, and marched out, the weight of the photo and the fire's heat still searing her mind. By morning, Hale's article hit the stands, a front-page screed titled, "Black Judge Faces Wild Claim from Problem Kid." It painted Malik as a delinquent, Evelyn as a loose cannon, and their bond as a dangerous fiction. The piece quoted anonymous sources, calling her unfit, her career a fluke built on affirmative action. Protesters doubled, their signs now joined by Confederate flags flapping in the humid Atlanta breeze. Evelyn skimmed the paper at her kitchen table, Malik asleep upstairs in her guest room, his soft snores a fragile anchor. She dialed her clerk, ordering the DNA test rushed through a private lab, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The Donovans' lawyer called minutes later, his tone oily with threat. "Drop this, Judge, or we'll bury you in court. That boy's a liar and you're a fool to believe him." She hung up, staring at the photo, its faded image a lifeline to a past she'd mourned too long. The fire, the mob, Hale's words, they were warnings, but she wouldn't bend. If Malik was Isaiah, her son stolen by a system that despised her skin, she'd tear it apart to get him back. The DNA test would prove it, she told herself, clinging to that shred of hope. But as the sun rose, casting long shadows across her hardwood floor, she couldn't shake the gnawing fear that the truth would cost more than she could bear. Evelyn Carter sat rigid at her kitchen table, the DNA test results trembling in her hands like a live wire. The lab's stark printout screamed the impossible. Malik Jackson, the 10-year-old boy who'd upended her courtroom, was her son, a 99.9% match. Her breath hitched, a sob clawing up her throat as she traced the numbers. 15 years ago, Mercy Grace Hospital had stolen her baby, her Isaiah, and now he stood upstairs, asleep in her guest room, his small frame curled under a quilt she'd sewn herself. How could a hospital rip a child from his mother's womb and call it a stillbirth? What kind of world let that lie fester for a decade and a half? She shoved the paper aside, her mind racing to the next step. She had proof now, a lifeline to reclaim what was hers, but the system she'd trusted her whole career loomed like a guillotine. She grabbed her phone, dialing Marcus Tate, her voice a low hiss as he picked up. "Marcus, it's positive. Malik's mine. I need you to get me every scrap of Mercy Grace's records from 15 years ago, anything that explains this." His reply came gruff, steady. "Already on it, Evelyn, but you're poking a bear. Stay sharp." She hung up, storming to her home office, pulling up the hospital's public archives online. The stillbirth file blinked back at her, a single page. No details, no autopsy, just a signature from a Dr. Leonard Voss, long retired. Suspicion coiled in her gut. Why was it so thin? Who had scrubbed the truth clean? She fired off an email to the hospital's legal department, demanding full records, her judicial title a battering ram she wasn't afraid to swing. By noon, Malik shuffled downstairs, rubbing sleep from his eyes, his oversized hoodie sagging off one shoulder. "Did the test come?" he asked, voice small but edged with hope. Evelyn knelt, pulling him into a fierce hug, her tears soaking his hair. "Yeah, kiddo, it did. You're mine, Malik. My son." His grin split wide, a rare burst of light in his shadowed face, and for a moment the world felt right. They spent the afternoon on her couch, him nestled against her, flipping through a photo album she'd dug out, pictures of her and Darius before the loss. "That's my dad?" he asked, pointing at a snapshot of Darius laughing on a porch swing. "Was," she corrected softly, "but he'd have loved you fierce." Could a stolen decade ever be stitched back together? She filed emergency custody. Papers online, her heart swelling with the dream of making it permanent. That dream shattered by dusk. A courier pounded on her door, delivering a lawsuit from Philip and Margaret Donovan, their signatures scrawled in bold ink. Defamation, they claimed, alleging Evelyn's reckless bias had smeared their pristine name as Atlanta's golden couple. The filing demanded $5 million and Malik's immediate removal from her care, calling her emotionally compromised. Fury boiled in her chest. How dare they turn her miracle into their weapon? She called her clerk, pushing the custody hearing to the next morning, but the response chilled her. "Judge Grayson's taking it, Evelyn. He's fast-tracked their suit, too." Harold Grayson, a white judge with a Confederate flag tie pin he swore was heritage, had ruled against black families for decades, his smirk a fixture in her nightmares. The hearing dawned grey and humid, the courthouse a fortress of tension. Evelyn stood at the bench, Malik beside her, his hand clutching hers as Grayson swaggered in, his robe billowing like a vulture's wings. The Donovans sat primly, their lawyer, Gerald Finch, oozing confidence in a pinstripe suit. "Your Honor," Finch began, voice slick as oil. "Judge Carter's let a disturbed child's fantasy derail justice. The Donovans are pillars of this community, not punching bags for her delusions." Grayson's eyes glinted, locking on Evelyn. "I've reviewed the boy's file. 8 homes, all failures. Seems he's trouble. And you, Judge Carter, are too close to this. I'm freezing custody pending a full investigation." Evelyn's voice cut sharp. "The DNA proves he's mine, Your Honor. That's fact, not bias." Grayson snorted, slamming his gavel. "Facts disputed, and you're gagged, Carter. No public statements or you're off the bench." Malik's grip tightened, his whisper a plea. "They can't take me, can they?" She squeezed back, her resolve steel. "Not if I can help it." But Grayson wasn't done. He ordered a psych evaluation for Malik, hinting at instability, and smirked as he adjourned, leaving Evelyn reeling. Outside, the mob from yesterday had tripled. Victor Hale at the helm, his camera crew filming as protesters waved signs, "Black Judge Lies," and "Protect White Families." Hale's latest piece blared from a nearby radio, his voice a venomous drawl. Evelyn Carter's playing the race card, folks, turning a thug into her pet project. Atlanta deserves better. A woman in a red sundress spat at Evelyn's feet as she ushered Malik to her car, the saliva glistening on the pavement like a badge of hate. They made it home. But the reprieve was fleeting. Her phone buzzed with a call from Mercy Grace's legal team, a nasal voice denying her records request. "Those files are lost, Judge Carter. Fire in the archives 10 years back. Nothing we can do." She slammed the phone down, her mind screaming conspiracy. Who torched the evidence? Why was the hospital fighting so hard? She paced her living room, Malik watching from the couch, his eyes tracking her every step. "They're scared of you," he said, voice steady beyond his years. "Good," she replied. "They should be." She emailed Marcus again, pushing him to dig deeper, her fingers flying over the keys as night fell. The clock struck midnight when the first brick crashed. Through her window, glass exploding across the hardwood floor. Malik yelped, diving behind the couch as Evelyn grabbed her old softball bat from the closet. A second brick followed, wrapped in a note. "Drop the case, nigger, or the boy burns." Her blood turned to ice. She peeked outside, spotting shadowed figures fleeing into the dark, their laughter a jagged echo. Malik crawled to her, trembling, and she pulled him close, her bat still in hand. "They won't win," she growled, but the firebombing of her car flashed in her mind. How far would they go to silence her? She called the cops, but the officer who arrived, a white rookie named Phelps, shrugged it off. Kids pranking, probably. No prints, no proof. His smirk said he didn't care. By morning, Grayson's gag order hit the news, Hale spinning it into a victory for law and order. Protesters camped outside her house, their chants a relentless drone. No black. "Justice, and give us the kid." Evelyn stood at her window, Malik behind her, his small hand slipping into hers. "I don't want to go back," he whispered, and she turned, kneeling to meet his gaze. "You won't. I'm fighting this, Malik, every step." She filed an appeal against Grayson's ruling, her legal mind churning, but the weight of his power pressed down. Could a single judge dismantle her life so easily? She glanced at the DNA results, her proof, her anchor, and swore she'd claw through hell to keep him. The day dragged on, tension thickening the air. Marcus texted, "Found. Something, call me." She dialed, his voice urgent. "Mercy Grace's old staff list has a nurse, Lila Brooks, who quit right after your stillbirth. She's off the grid now, but I'm tracking her." Hope flickered, then dimmed as her TV blared Hale's latest hit piece, a grainy photo of Malik from a foster file plastered across the screen, captioned "Thug or Porn." The mob outside roared approval, a Molotov cocktail sizzling on her lawn before fizzling out. Evelyn yanked the curtains shut, her pulse a war drum. What kind of city turned a child into a target? Drop a comment with number 1 if you think the system's rigged against Malik. Hit that like button if you're rooting for Evelyn's fight, and subscribe because tomorrow's twist will leave you speechless. So, what happens when Evelyn digs into Mercy Grace's past? Will Lila Brooks hold the key, or will the Donovans' next move bury them both? Evelyn Carter's phone buzzed relentlessly on her kitchen counter. Marcus Tate's name flashing as dawn bled through the curtains. She answered, her voice a hoarse rasp after a sleepless night, guarding Malik from the shadows outside. "Talk." "To me, Marcus," she demanded, glancing at her son, who sat at the table poking at a bowl of oatmeal with a spoon. Marcus's growl came through, thick with urgency. "Found her, Evelyn. Lila Brooks, nurse at Mercy Grace 15 years ago. She's holed up in a trailer park outside Macon, scared stiff. Says she'll talk, but only to you in person." Evelyn's pulse spiked, a jolt of adrenaline cutting through her exhaustion. Could this woman unravel the lie that stole her son? She scribbled the address, her hand shaking, and turned to Malik. "Stay here. Lock the doors. I'll be back." "Soon," he nodded, his trust a fragile thread she clung to. She drove south, the Atlanta skyline shrinking in her rearview, the highway stretching into Georgia's red dirt heart. Macon loomed, a sleepy sprawl of pines and peeling billboards, and she found Lila's trailer tucked behind a sagging gas station. The woman who opened the door was a ghost of her past, 50-ish, her brown hair streaked gray, eyes darting like a trapped animal's. "Judge Carter?" Lila whispered, ushering her inside. The trailer stank of stale coffee and fear, cluttered with stacks of yellowed papers. Evelyn cut to the chase, her voice steel. "You were there when my son was born. Tell me what happened." Lila sank onto a threadbare couch, her hands twisting a frayed napkin. "It wasn't just yours. They ran a ring, Mercy Grace did. Took black babies from unfit mothers, sold them to rich white folks. Your boy, they said he'd fetch a high price." Evelyn's stomach churned, bile rising as Lila's words sank in. "Who's they?" she pressed, leaning forward, her shadow looming over the trembling nurse. Lila's voice dropped to a whisper. "Dr. Voss, the head OB. He'd fake complications, rush mums into surgery, then swap the babies out. Told you yours was stillborn, but he was alive, screaming. They sold him to the Prestons, a couple from Buckhead, paid 50 grand cash." Evelyn's fists clenched, nails biting her palms. The Prestons, old money, real estate barons, tied to the Donovans through a maze of LLCs. "And after?" she growled. Lila's eyes welled up. "They dumped him in foster care when he wouldn't fit. Too loud, too black for their perfect life. I quit after that, couldn't stomach it, but they threatened me silent." Evelyn's mind raced, piecing. Fair together. Malik, her Isaiah stolen, sold, discarded like trash by a system that saw black lives as commodities. She snatched a stack of Lila's papers, pay stubs, memos, a photo of Voss with a smug grin, and stood, her resolve a blazing furnace. "You're testifying, Lila. This ends now." Lila nodded, fragile but firm, and Evelyn sped back to Atlanta, the evidence a ticking bomb in her passenger seat. She felt invincible, the truth finally in her grasp, a weapon to reclaim her son and torch the liars who'd caged him. That illusion cracked the moment she hit the city. Her phone lit up with a text from Gerald Finch, the Donovans' lawyer. "A new suit filed. Drop your claims or we'll ruin you." She stormed into her office, pulling up the filing online. The Donovans had escalated, countersuing for emotional distress and slander, demanding Malik's permanent removal, claiming his lies destabilized their family. Their evidence? A forged letter, supposedly from Malik, confessing he'd made it all up for attention. Evelyn's blood boiled. How could they twist a child's pain into their shield? She called Marcus, barking orders. "Link the Donovans to the Prestons now. Lila's story's our ace." He grunted assent, already digging, but Judge Harold Grayson struck faster. By noon, a bailiff delivered his latest ruling. Malik was to be ripped from her emergency custody and dumped into Carver House, a group home notorious for broken bones and whispered screams. Evelyn's appeal was still pending, but Grayson didn't care, his order dripping with contempt. "The boy's a risk," he'd written, "and Carter's unfit to parent under scrutiny." She raced to the courthouse, Malik in tow, his small hand trembling in hers as she pleaded with the clerk. "He's my son, DNA proven. This is illegal." The clerk shrugged, Grayson's shadow looming over every desk. They took him anyway. Two beefy guards in tan uniforms pried Malik from her arms, his cries echoing down the marble hall. "Mum, don't let him!" he screamed, kicking as they dragged him to a van. Evelyn lunged, but a third guard shoved her back, his sneer a blade. "Back off, lady, or you're next." She watched, helpless, as the van peeled out, her son's face pressed to the window, fading into the Atlanta haze. Her knees buckled, but she caught herself on a pillar, fury swallowing her grief. She stormed Grayson's chambers, slamming Lila's memo on his desk. "You're in this, Harold. Payouts from Mercy Grace, explain that." He laughed, a dry rasp, and leaned back in his chair. "Prove it, Evelyn." "Oh, wait. You're gagged. Contempt, 30 days. He snapped his fingers, and deputies cuffed, her wrists chafing as they hauled her to a cell. The jail stank of sweat and bleach, her cell a concrete box with a rusted cot. She paced, her mind a whirlwind of plans, when her phone slipped through by a sympathetic guard, buzzed with a call from Marcus. "Malik's at Carver," he said, voice tight. "Got a tip he's hurt already. Beaten bad. Photos gone." Evelyn's heart seized, her fists pounding the wall until her knuckles bled. "Get him out, Marcus, whatever it takes," she hissed, "and nail Grayson with that memo." He promised to try, but the line cut as a guard snatched the phone, leaving her in silence, the weight of her failure crushing her chest. Hours bled into night, her mind replaying Malik's screams, the Donovans' smug faces, Grayson's laugh. She'd had the truth, Lila's confession, a chance to win, but they'd turned it against her faster and harder than she'd imagined. Carver House wasn't just a home. It was a meat grinder, run by a sadist named Earl Tate, Marcus's distant cousin with a rap sheet he'd dodged through bribes. She pictured Malik, bruised and alone, his lifeline to her, the photo stolen by those monsters. How could a judge jail her for fighting for her own blood? What kind of system rewarded thieves and punished mothers? By morning, her contempt charge hit the news, Victor Hale's voice oozing from a guard's radio. "Judge Carter's locked up, folks. Proof she's unhinged. That kid's better off without her." She gritted her teeth, the lie a fresh wound, but a sliver of hope flickered when Marcus slipped a note through a trustee. "Found Preston ties to Donovan Properties. Working on Malik. Hang on." She clutched it, her lifeline in the dark, but the cell door clanged open, Grayson's deputy looming. "Court's reconvening. Your mess just got bigger." She stood, wrists still raw, her mind sharpening to a razor's edge. They thought they'd broken her, but they'd only lit the fuse. Back in the courtroom, Grayson glared from his perch, the Donovans smirking beside Finch. "Your antics end here, Carter," he sneered, tossing her appeal aside. "Carver's where he belongs." Evelyn's voice rang out, defiant, despite the cuffs. "You're burying evidence, Harold. Lila Brooks saw it all and your name's on the take." The gallery murmured, but Grayson's gavel crashed, silencing them. "Another word, and it's 6 months." She bit her tongue, her eyes burning into him, knowing Malik's fate hung on her next move. The Donovans had countered her truth with lies, Grayson had caged her, and Carver was breaking her son. She'd been so close. Lila's words, a victory, snatched away by a system rigged to crush her. As they dragged her back to jail, a scream echoed in her mind. Malik's from that van, pleading for her to fight. She would, she swore, even if it meant tearing down every brick of this rotten city. But how long could he survive Carver's brutality? And what would the Donovans unleash next to keep their empire intact? Evelyn Carter's jail cell felt like a coffin, the concrete walls closing in as she counted the hours since Malik had been torn from her arms. 3 days into her contempt sentence, her wrists still bore the cuff's red welts, but her mind burned hotter than ever. She'd bailed Malik out of Carver House the moment a sympathetic judge, nudged by Marcus Tate's backroom calls, sprang her loose. Public outrage had erupted after Tasha Reid, a fierce black journalist with a local cable show, aired a grainy cell phone clip of Malik's bruised face, his lips split, his left eye swollen shut from the group home's discipline. Evelyn had stormed the facility herself, shoving past Earl Tate's sneering guards, her voice a thunderclap as she demanded her son. "If you touch him again, I'll bury you," she'd spat, cradling Malik as he limped into her arms, his trust in her unbroken despite the blood crusting his cheek. Now, safe in her trashed living room, glass still crunching underfoot from the mob's bricks, Evelyn watched Malik sleep on the couch, his chest rising and falling under a borrowed blanket. She'd taken Tasha's call an hour ago, her friend's voice electric with purpose. "I'm putting this on every screen in Atlanta," Tasha had vowed. "Carver's a slaughterhouse, and Grayson's a crook. Let's see him squirm." By noon the segment hit, Tasha's sharp narration slicing through the city's airwaves. "This is Malik Jackson, 11 years old, beaten in a state-run hellhole while Judge Harold Grayson locks up his mother, Judge Evelyn Carter, for daring to fight back. Why? Because she's black, and he's her son." Footage rolled. Malik's battered face, Carver's grim facade, a leaked memo from Lila Brooks naming Grayson as a Mercy Grace payout pig. Atlanta's black community roared, flooding social media with hashtags and protest calls, their fury a tidal wave Evelyn hadn't expected. But the backlash came swift and vicious. Victor Hale, ever the venomous puppet, twisted Tasha's scoop into a racist fever dream on his evening broadcast. "Carter's turned this into a race war," he sneered, his blonde hair slick under studio lights. "She's grooming that thug to riot, and now she's got her radical friends fanning the flames." His words lit a match. By dusk, a white supremacist crew, the Southern Guardians, rolled into downtown, led by Travis Boone, a hulking ex-cop with a shaved head and a swastika tattoo creeping up his neck. Evelyn's office at the courthouse became their target, a bomb ripping through the second floor, shattering windows and torching her desk. She raced to the scene, Malik under FBI watch at a safe house, her stomach dropping as she saw the wreckage, files. Charred walls smeared with red paint spelling, "Nigger Judge Die." Boone stood across the street, grinning for Hale's cameras, his voice booming over the chaos. "This is what happens when you let 'em run the system. We're taking it back." Cops milled nearby, their radios crackling, but none moved to arrest him, their inaction a silent endorsement. Evelyn's fists balled, her breath fogging in the crisp night air as she snapped photos of the slur, texting them to Tasha. "Air this," she typed, her fingers trembling with rage. How could a city watch this and do nothing? She stormed to the precinct, demanding Boone's arrest, but Captain Lyle, a white vet with a drawl thick as molasses, shrugged her off. "No witnesses, Judge. Could have been anyone." His smirk said he knew exactly who'd lit the fuse. Back home, she found Marcus waiting, his scarred knuckles tapping her kitchen table, Lila's memo in his grip. "Grayson's dirty, Evelyn. This ties him to Mercy Grace payouts, 50 grand a year for 15 years. He buried your case to protect himself." She snatched it, scanning the scrawled numbers, her hope surging. "This ends him," she said, slamming it down. "File it with the feds now." Marcus nodded, but his eyes darkened. "Boone's tied to the Donovans, too. Donation records show they've funneled him cash for years. They're all in this." Her mind reeled. The Donovans, Philip and Margaret, pristine on the surface, funding hate to keep Malik silent. Could their greed stretch that far? She took the memo to court the next morning, Malik safe with Marcus, her heels clicking as she faced Grayson in his chambers. "But you're done, Harold," she said, tossing the evidence onto his desk, her voice ablade. "Mercy Grace paid you to cover their tracks. Step down, or I'll bury you." Grayson's face flushed purple, his jowls quivering as he leaned back, a dry laugh rattling his throat. "Cute story, Evelyn, but you're gagged. One more stunt and it's contempt again." She glared, unflinching. "This isn't a stunt. It's your grave." He smirked, scribbling an order, and minutes later deputies hauled her back to jail. 30 more days slapped on her sentence. "Disrespecting the court," he called it, his gavel's crack a gunshot in her ears. Locked up again, Evelyn's cell buzzed with a smuggled call from Tasha. "Grayson suspended your license," she said, voice tight. "Says you're unstable, a danger to the bench." Evelyn's heart sank, her career crumbling under racist lies, but Tasha wasn't done. "I aired the memo. It's viral, Evelyn. People are pissed." She clung to that, her knuckles whitening against the bars. But the Donovans struck harder. Philip's voice oozed from a TV in the guard station, a press conference clip. "That boy's a gang recruit, a liar Carter's coddling. We're law-abiding citizens, not monsters." Margaret dabbed fake tears, her diamond earrings glinting as she nodded. Evelyn's rage flared. Gang recruit. Malik 11, who'd never held a weapon. How could they smear a child to save their skin? The jail's fluorescent hum was drowned by a roar outside. Protesters, hundreds strong, black and brown faces, chanting her name, "Free Evelyn, justice for Malik." She pressed her face to the barred window, tears streaking her cheeks as their signs bobbed in the dusk. "End racist judges, and Malik deserves his mum." Hope flickered, fragile, but real, until a guard's radio crackled with Hale's latest venom. "Carter's radicals are burning Atlanta down, folks. That thug's their mascot." The crowd's roar turned to screams as Boone's guardians charged, fists and bats swinging, blood staining the pavement. Evelyn pounded the bars, helpless, her son's bruised face flashing in her mind. Marcus slipped her a note through a trustee at midnight, his scrawl jagged. "Malik's safe, but Boone's loose. Guardians claiming he's theirs. Feds moving slow." She crumpled it, her chest heaving. She'd exposed Grayson, rallied a city, but Boone's bomb and the Donovans' lies flipped her victory into chaos. Grayson's suspension of her license wasn't just a slap. It was a noose choking her power to fight. The memo proved his corruption, but he'd jailed her anyway, laughing as he did it. How could one man wield such hate unchecked? She sank onto the cot, her mind racing to Malik, alone without her, his trust in her battered by fists and fire. By morning, Tasha's broadcast hit again, her voice a lifeline through the guard's TV. "Grayson's memo's real, folks. He's a crook, and Boone's a terrorist funded by the Donovans. Atlanta, wake up." The jail shook with distant chants, but Evelyn's cell door clanged open, Grayson's deputy sneering. "Court's back, Carter. Your boy's next." She stood, her spine steel, knowing the Donovans wouldn't stop. Boone wouldn't yield, and Malik's life hung on her breaking free. Drop a comment with number 1 if you think Boone deserves a cell. Hit that like button if Evelyn's courage inspires you. And subscribe because tomorrow's showdown will blow your mind. So, with Evelyn caged and Boone unleashed, can Marcus save Malik before the Guardians strike again? Marcus Tate sat in a dank holding cell beneath the Fulton County Courthouse, the concrete walls slick with dampness, the air heavy with the sour reek of sweat and despair. His wrists ached where the cuffs had bitten into his skin, and a bruise throbbed on his cheek from where the SWAT team had slammed him into Lena's carpet. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow on the graffiti scratched into the bench beside him, names and curses from men who'd been here before. He'd been arrested on a lie, evidence tampering, a charge cooked up by Judge Evelyn Carver's allies to bury him after he dared to drag her bribery ledger into the light. His mind raced, replaying the chaos of the raid, the cameras flashing. As they hauled him out, the reporters shout about him planting the ledger. It was a masterstroke, turning his own weapon against him, and he'd walked right into it thinking the truth would be enough. Now he was locked in a 6x8 cage, his suit rumpled, his tie gone, and his phone confiscated. But Marcus wasn't done. He'd been in tight spots before, talked his way out of corners that would have broken lesser men, and he wasn't about to let Carver's goons snap his spine now. He tapped his foot against the floor, the rhythm steadying his pulse, and started working the angles. He had one call left, and he'd used it an hour ago, whispering to Lena through a crackling line. "Get the ledger back up," he'd told her, his voice low, urgent. "It's on my cloud drive, password's your birthday, send it to Tanya." Lena had hesitated, her breath shaky, but she'd promised, and Marcus trusted her with his life. She was his rock, the one who'd patched him up after every fight, literal and legal, since they were kids dodging bullets in Bankhead. He closed, his eyes picturing her at home, dodging the mess of their trashed house to dig into his files. If she could get that ledger to Tanya Ellis, the reporter who'd broken the first story, they could turn this around. Hours crawled by, the cell growing colder, the sounds of other inmates shouting and banging echoing down the hall. Marcus kept his head down, his mind sharp, waiting for the dominoes to fall. By dawn, they did. The guard, a burly white guy with A mustache that looked like it belonged in a 70s cop show banged on the bars. "Tate, you're out," he grunted, unlocking the door with a clang. Marcus stood, smoothing his wrinkled jacket, and followed him out, his heart pounding with a mix of dread and hope. In the release room, Lena waited, her arms crossed, her face a mask of exhaustion and defiance. She handed him his phone. Her voice barely above a whisper. "Tanya aired it," she said, and Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him. He stepped outside, the morning sun blinding after the cell's gloom, and saw the chaos unfolding. News vans lined the street. Protesters clogged the courthouse steps, their chants a roar that shook the air. "Free Marcus! Jail Carver!" Pulled up Tanya's latest piece on his phone, a shaky video she'd posted at 3 in the morning. There it was, the ledger, every page scanned and narrated in her gravelly voice, tying Carver to the Sons of Liberty, to Grayson's cash, to a dozen cases where black men had been crushed under her gavel. The video ended with a clip from the courtroom, Carver's voice screaming that slur, uppity little nigger, caught on the court recorder's mic, raw and unfiltered. It had gone viral, millions of views in hours, and Atlanta was burning. With it, riots sparked downtown, tires screeching, glass shattering, as fury over Carver's corruption spilled into the streets. Marcus was out on bail by noon, a sympathetic judge setting it low after the video hit, and he headed straight to court, his borrowed car rattling through the city's chaos. The Fulton County Courthouse loomed ahead, surrounded by a sea of bodies, police in riot gear holding the line. Inside, the gallery was a madhouse, standing room only, the air thick with sweat and anticipation. Jamal sat at the defense table, his eyes wide but steady, and Marcus clapped a hand on his shoulder as he took his seat. Carver entered, her robe crisp, her face a wall of ice, but her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the gavel. She'd been suspended pending a federal review, the news breaking mid-morning, and this was her last chance to twist the knife before the hammer fell. Ethan Brooks stood, his suit wrinkled, his confidence shaken, and fumbled through a motion to delay. Marcus didn't wait. He rose, his voice booming, and pulled out his ace. A USB drive with the courtroom audio, the slur looped and clear as day. "Your Honor," he said, holding it up like a grenade, "this is what you are, and the world knows it now." He played it through a portable speaker, the words blasting through the room, "uppity little nigger," over and over, until the gallery erupted, shouts and gasps drowning out Brooks's weak objection. Carver's face went white, her gavel slamming uselessly, but Marcus kept going, his eyes locked on hers. "You're suspended and you're finished," he said, his voice a blade, and sat down, the room spinning around him. The new judge rushed in to oversee, granted the suspension, and Carver stormed out, her exit a defeated shuffle. Marcus exhaled, a rush of triumph flooding his veins, and Jamal grinned, a rare flash of teeth. They'd won, or so he thought. He left the courthouse, the sun dipping low, the protest still raging, and drove to a friend's place to crash, his body aching but his spirit soaring. He was halfway through a cold beer, the bottle sweating in his hand, when the night turned black. A roar split the air, tires screeching, and a mob descended on the quiet street, 20 men in hoodies and boots, their faces shadowed but their intent clear. They smashed windows, kicked in doors, and Marcus bolted upright, the beer crashing to the floor. He grabbed a kitchen knife, his pulse hammering as they stormed the house, chants of Carver's justice ringing in his ears. He fought back, slashing at arms and legs, but there were too many. A fist caught his jaw, another his ribs, and then he heard a scream, high and young. His nephew, Malik, 16 and skinny, had been upstairs, visiting from Macon. They dragged him out, his sneakers squeaking on the wood, and Marcus lunged, only to be pinned by 3 men, his knife clattering away. The mob beat Malik senseless, fists and boots raining down, blood pooling on the floor, and Marcus roared, helpless, his voice raw. They left as fast as they'd come, tires peeling out, and Marcus crawled to Malik, the boy's face swollen, his breathing shallow. A note was stuffed in his pocket, scrawled in black ink. "Carver sends regards." Marcus cradled him, tears burning his eyes, the triumph of her suspension turning to ash in his mouth. He turned the tables, exposed her to the world, but She'd hit back with a savagery that broke his family, not just his car or his home. Malik groaned, alive but battered, and Marcus dialed 911, his hands shaking as sirens wailed in the distance. Carver's followers were her claws, and they'd torn into his blood, proving she'd never let a win stand. He'd thought he'd caged her, but she was still a beast, and the fight was far from over. Marcus Tate knelt on the blood-streaked floor of his friend's house, his hands cradling his nephew Malik's limp form, the boy's shallow breaths rasping against the chaos of the night. The mob had vanished, their boots leaving muddy prints. And the note, "Carver sends regards," crumpled in Marcus's fist. His throat burned with unshed tears, his ribs aching from the blows he'd taken, but the pain in his chest was deeper, a clawing guilt that he'd dragged his family into this war. Sirens wailed closer, red and blue lights painting the walls, and paramedics burst in, prying Malik from his arms. They strapped him to a stretcher, his swollen face barely recognizable, and Marcus stumbled after them, his shoes slipping in the crimson smears. At the hospital, he paced the sterile waiting room, the antiseptic smell stinging his nose, the clock ticking past midnight. Lena arrived, her eyes wild, her voice breaking as she grabbed his arm. "What did they do to him?" she demanded, and Marcus couldn't meet her gaze, just muttered, "Carver," the name a curse on his tongue. Malik was in surgery, a fractured skull and broken ribs, and every beep from the machines down the hall was a dagger in Marcus's gut. He'd won in court, forced Carver's suspension with that viral audio, but this was her answer, a brutality. That dwarfed the car bomb and the break-in. She wasn't just fighting him, she was hunting him, and his family was collateral damage. He sank into a plastic chair, his hands shaking, and vowed she'd pay, not just for Jamal, not just for himself, but for Malik's blood on her hands. The next morning, with Malik stable but unconscious, Marcus drove to the federal building, the city still smoldering from the riots sparked by Tanya's video. His borrowed car rattled over potholes, the ledger backup burning a hole in his pocket. He'd turned the tables once, but now he needed to bury her. The suspension hearing was in 2 days, a closed-door session with the Judicial Review Board, and he'd been summoned to testify. He met Keisha Monroe outside, her protest crew smaller now, weary but fierce, their signs sagging in the humid air. "We're with you," she said, clapping his shoulder, and he nodded, his jaw tight. Inside the room was a stark contrast to Carver's courtroom, all beige walls and fluorescent glare, a panel of 5 suits staring down from a long table. Marcus took the stand, his voice steady despite the exhaustion clawing at him, and laid out everything. The ledger, the Sons of Liberty, the overturned cases, the slur, the mob. He played the audio again, Carver's voice spitting venom, and added a new piece, a recorded call from an ex-clerk who'd seen her take Grayson's cash in person. The panel scribbled notes, their faces unreadable, and Marcus felt the weight shift, a crack widening in her fortress. Hours later, they recessed, promising a ruling soon, and he stepped outside, the sun harsh on his bruised face. That night, the news broke. Carver was indicted, federal charges piling up, bribery, obstruction, civil rights violations. Marcus watched it unfold on Lena's TV, the screen flickering in the dim living room, her couch still littered with debris from the break-in. Tanya Ellis's voice narrated the scoop. Judge Evelyn Carver, once untouchable, now faces justice, and Marcus let out a breath he'd been holding for weeks. Protesters cheered outside the courthouse, a victory roar that echoed through the city, and he felt a surge of triumph, a fleeting taste of relief. He texted Jamal, "We got her," and cracked a beer, the cold glass a small comfort against the ache in his bones. He'd done it, brought her down a peg, maybe more, and Atlanta was alive with it, but the high didn't last. The next morning he woke to a call from the hospital, Lena's voice trembling through the line. "Marcus, get here now," she said, and he was out the door in seconds, his heart pounding. He sped through traffic, the city a blur, and burst into Malik's room. The beep of monitors a steady pulse in the sterile air. Lena stood by the bed, her hands clasped tight, and Marcus froze. A doctor in a white coat stepped forward, his face grim. "Your sister's car was run off the road last night," he said, and Marcus's knees buckled. Lena was alive, but in a coma, her sedan found crumpled in a ditch off I-85, skid marks showing she'd been forced off. She'd been driving home from the hospital, alone, and now she lay in a bed 2 floors up, tubes snaking from her arms, her braids fanned across. The pillow. Marcus stumbled to her side, his hand gripping hers, her skin cold against his warmth. A nurse handed him a note found in the wreckage, scribbled in the same black ink as Malik's. "You're next." His vision blurred, tears spilling hot down his cheeks, and he sank into a chair, the room spinning. This was Carver, her claws striking again, even as she faced indictment. He called Keisha, his voice hoarse, and she arrived with Terrell, their faces pale with shock. "She's not stopping," Marcus said, the note trembling in his hand, and Keisha cursed loud and raw. They pieced it together, the timing too perfect, the message too clear. Then the TV in the waiting room flared to life, a breaking news alert cutting through the haze. The governor, a ruddy-faced white man named Clayton Voss, Carver's old law school buddy, stood at a podium, his tie crisp, his voice booming. "Atlanta's had enough of these troublemakers," he said, his eyes hard. "We're cleaning up. This mess, starting with the instigators." Marcus's stomach dropped. The words a coded threat, and he knew Voss meant him, the man who dared to topple Carver. The indictment was a win, a massive blow to her empire, but it had unleashed something bigger, a system rallying to protect its own. He'd celebrated too soon, thought the feds would cage her, but she'd struck back with a precision that left his sister fighting for life. Malik groaned in his bed, stirring slightly, and Marcus looked between him and the note, the weight of his fight crushing him. He'd exposed her to the state, but her allies stretched to the governor's mansion, and they weren't done. Lena's coma was a warning, a promise of more blood, and Marcus felt the ground slip beneath him, his triumph turning to terror. He stood, wiping his face, and gripped the note tighter, his resolve hardening. Carver was indicted, but the war was escalating, and he was in the crosshairs of a machine that wouldn't quit. How far would you go to protect your family from a system this rotten? Comment number 1 if you think Marcus should have seen this coming. Smash that like button if you're raging at Carver's revenge, and subscribe because this story is diving deeper into the abyss. Can Marcus fight a governor who's ready to bury him next? Marcus Tate stood in the hospital hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing like a swarm of angry bees, his reflection distorted in the polished floor beneath him. His sister Lena lay in a coma 2 doors down, her breathing a mechanical hiss through tubes, while his nephew Malik slept fitfully in another room, his face a map of bruises from the mob's attack. The note, "You're next," was folded in his pocket, its edges worn from his restless fingers, a constant reminder of Judge Evelyn, Carver's unrelenting wrath. Her indictment had been a victory, a crack in her empire, but it hadn't stopped her. If anything, it had sharpened her claws, and now Governor Clayton Voss's voice echoed in his head, promising to clean up Atlanta's troublemakers. Marcus knew he was the target, a black man who dared to challenge their system, and the cost was piling up in blood and silence. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, just paced the halls, his borrowed shoes squeaking on the tile, his mind racing for a way to strike back. He needed more than the ledger, more than the courtroom audio. He needed to rip Carver's mask off, completely. He slipped into Malik's room, the boy's chest rising and falling under a thin blanket, and pulled out his phone, its cracked screen glowing in the dark. He'd backed up everything, every file, every note, but there was one angle he hadn't tried: Carver's own words. She was too careful in public, but behind closed doors she might have slipped. He called Terrell, Jamal's cousin, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I need you to hack her emails," he said, and Terrell didn't hesitate. "On it," he replied, the line clicking dead. Hours later, as dawn broke over Atlanta's smog-choked skyline, Terrell texted back, "Check your inbox, Marcus." Opened it, his breath catching as he scrolled through a trove of messages. Carver's private correspondence with Grayson, with cops, with Voss himself. One stood out, dated the day before Jamal's trial. "Make sure Reed's case sticks. Ethan needs a win, and I need that shop owner quiet." It was proof, raw and undeniable, that she'd rigged the case from the start, coaching Ethan Brooks. and silencing witnesses. His hands shook, not with fear but with a fury that burned white hot. This was his lifeline, his way to end her. He didn't wait. He drove straight to the courthouse, the city waking up around him, horns blaring. The air thick with exhaust and tension. Carver's federal trial was underway, a sealed proceeding. But Marcus had a contact, a clerk named Javier who owed him a favor from a case years back. He slipped Javier the email printouts in the hallway, his voice low. "Get these to the judge," he said, and Javier nodded, disappearing into the chaos. Marcus waited outside, his heart pounding, the crowd thinning as the morning stretched on. Then it happened. The doors flew open, reporters spilling out, shouting over each other, and Marcus caught the words, "mistrial." He pushed through, elbowing past cameras, and found Javier in the lobby, a grin splitting his face. "They saw it," he said. "Jamal's free." Marcus bolted to the holding area, where Jamal stood, his wrists uncuffed, his eyes wide with disbelief. The new judge had thrown out the case, the email proving Carver's tampering too blatant to ignore. Marcus grabbed him, pulling him into a fierce hug, Jamal's laughter shaky against his shoulder. "I'm out, man," Jamal said, his voice breaking, and Marcus nodded, a weight lifting off his chest. They stepped outside, the sun high, the air buzzing with news drones and cheers from Keisha's protesters, who'd rushed over from a rally. Jamal raised his fists, a free man, and Marcus felt a rush of joy, a fleeting taste of justice. He drove Jamal home, the mechanic's baby girl squealing as she toddled into his arms, and for a moment Marcus let himself breathe, the victory sinking in. He'd turned desperation into a win, cracked Carver's grip on Jamal, and sent a ripple through her trial. But the high was short-lived. That evening, as he parked outside Lena's house, the borrowed car shuddering to a stop, a shadow moved across the street. He squinted, his hand on the door handle, when a crack split the air, sharp and deafening. A bullet whizzed past his head, grazing his arm, tearing through his sleeve and leaving a hot streak of blood. He dove to the ground, gravel biting into his palms, his heart slamming against his ribs. Another shot rang out, pinging off the car's hood, and he crawled behind the wheel, his breath ragged. Footsteps crunched nearby, deliberate and slow, and a voice hissed through the dusk. "She sends her regards." Marcus peeked over the dash, catching a glimpse of a figure in a black jacket, a rifle glinting in the fading light, before they vanished into an alley. He fumbled for his phone, his arm throbbing, blood dripping onto the seat, and dialed 911, his voice shaking as he barked his location. Sirens wailed in the distance, but he stayed low, the sniper's words echoing in his skull. Carver's trial was crumbling, Jamal was free, but she'd struck back with a precision that turned his stomach. He pressed his sleeve against the wound, the fabric soaking red, and sirens grew louder. Lights flashing as cops swarmed the scene. They found casings, 2 brass shells glinting on the pavement, but no shooter, no witnesses, just Marcus bleeding in the dirt. A cop, a wiry black guy with tired eyes, crouched beside him, his badge reading Owens. "You're lucky," he said, wrapping a bandage from a kit around Marcus's arm. But Marcus shook his head, his voice raw. "Luck's got nothing to do with it." Owens paused, then nodded, his gaze flickering to the street. "She's got friends," he muttered, and walked away, leaving Marcus with the paramedics. They patched him up, a shallow graze, no stitches needed, but the sting lingered, a reminder of how close he'd come. He sat in the ambulance, the doors open, the night pressing in, and felt the weight of Carver's desperation. She'd lost Jamal, lost control of her courtroom, and now she was a cornered animal, lashing out with bullets instead of gavels. The mistrial was a win, a massive blow to her empire, but it had painted a target on his back, bigger and bloodier than before. He'd thought he could outsmart her, thought the law would shield him, but she'd turned it into a weapon, her allies willing to kill to keep her afloat. His phone buzzed, a text from Keisha. "You okay?" He didn't reply, just stared at the shells on the ground, the cop's words ringing in his ears. Carver wasn't just fighting to save herself, she was fighting to destroy him, and this was her loudest roar yet. He climbed out of the ambulance, his arm stiff, his resolve hardening, and knew the war had shifted. She'd drawn blood, real blood, and he wasn't running. Not yet. Marcus Tate stood in the shadow of the ambulance, his arm throbbing where the sniper's bullet had grazed him, the bandage soaked with a thin line of blood that seeped through his sleeve. The night air was thick with the tang of gunpowder and exhaust, Atlanta's streets alive with the wail of sirens and the hum of news helicopters circling overhead. The casings glinted on the pavement, two brass shells that marked Judge Evelyn Carver's latest strike, her voice echoing through that hissed threat. She sends her regards. His chest burned with a fury that drowned out the pain, a fire stoked by every blow she'd landed. The car bomb, the break-in, Malik's beating, Lena's coma, and now this, a shot meant to silence him for good. He'd freed Jamal with the Mistral, cracked her trial wide open with those emails. But she'd turned the city into a battlefield, her desperation a wildfire he couldn't outrun. He climbed into the borrowed car, his hands steady despite the tremor in his soul, and drove. To a cheap motel off I-20, the neon sign flickering vacancy in the dark. He couldn't go back to Lena's, couldn't risk another ambush, so he paid cash for a room with stained carpet and a mattress that sagged like defeat. He locked the door, propped a chair under the knob, and pulled out his phone. It's cracked. Screen a mirror of his fractured life. The emails Terrell had hacked were still there, a goldmine of Carver's sins, but he needed more than a courtroom win now. He needed to bury her in the court of public opinion, where her allies couldn't shield her. He called Tanya Ellis, the reporter who'd been his megaphone, and she answered on the first ring, her voice sharp with adrenaline. "Marcus, you're alive," she said, and he grunted, "Barely." He sent her the emails, every damning line, and added a voice memo, his words raw. "She's shooting at me now, Tanya. Get this out, all of it." She didn't hesitate. "Give me an hour," she said, and the line went dead. By midnight, Tanya's broadcast hit the airwaves, a national TV spot on a 24-hour news channel, her face grim under the studio lights. She held up the emails, reading them aloud, Carver's orders to rig Jamal's case, her boasts about keeping Atlanta clean, her coded threats to deal with Tate. The screen cut to footage of the sniper scene, shaky phone videos from neighbors showing Marcus diving for cover, the crack of gunfire splitting the night. Then came the audio, Carver's slur from the courtroom, looped with the emails, a symphony of corruption that made anchors gasp and pundits stammer. It exploded online, trending in minutes, hashtags like Carver must fall and Justice for Marcus, lighting up screens across the country. Marcus watched it unfold from the motel, the TV's grainy glow casting shadows on the peeling walls, and felt a surge of power, a fleeting sense that he'd turned the tide. The next morning, federal agents moved, raiding Grayson's mansion, cuffing Sons of Liberty goons in dawn sweeps, their mugshots plastered on every channel. Carver's network was scattering, her allies running scared, and Marcus let himself hope, just for a moment, that he'd broken her back. He checked on Malik at the hospital, the boy awake now, groggy but grinning, and called Jamal, who whooped over the phone, "You're a legend, man." Marcus smiled, a rare crack in his armor, and thought maybe, just maybe, he'd won. But Carver wasn't done. That afternoon, as he grabbed coffee from a gas station near the motel, his phone buzzed with a news alert. Grand jury indicts Marcus Tate for inciting violence. His stomach dropped, the styrofoam cup slipping from his hand, coffee splattering across the cracked linoleum. He pulled up the story, his face staring back from a mugshot taken after the SWAT raid, the headline screaming lies. The grand jury, stacked with Carver's cronies, claimed his leaks and protests had sparked the riots, pinning every broken window and burning car on him. He stumbled outside, the air hot and sticky, his mind reeling. This wasn't just revenge. It was a guillotine, a legal noose to choke him out while she sat in her cell. He drove back to the motel, his hands gripping the wheel, and saw the fallout unfolding. Protests turned bloody downtown, cops clashing with Keisha's crew, tear gas clouding the streets, batons cracking skulls. He flipped on the TV, the news, a blur of chaos, and then the real blow landed. A fire truck's siren wailed outside, and he ran to the window, peering through the blinds. Across the city, his apartment building was ablaze, flames licking the sky, a news chopper capturing the inferno live. The anchor's voice cut through. Arson suspected, linked to tensions over Tate's indictment. Marcus sank to the bed, his breath shallow, the room spinning. His home, his last anchor, was gone, reduced to ash and smoke. And he knew it. Was her final torching of his life? He grabbed his phone, calling Keisha, his voice cracking. "They burned my place," he said, and she cursed, loud and fierce. "They're coming for you, Marcus," she replied, the clash of the protest loud behind her. He hung up, his eyes fixed on the TV, the fire's orange glow a mirror of the rage in his chest. He'd exposed her to the nation, sent her empire into a tailspin, but she'd hit back with a vengeance that left him homeless, hunted and alone. The grand jury was her shield, the fire her sword, and the protests her chaos, all twisted to crush him. He rummaged through his bag, pulling out the USB with the courtroom audio, the emails, everything he had left, and clutched it tight, his knuckles white. His arm still ached from the sniper's graze. His family lay broken in hospital beds, and now his home was cinders. But he wasn't finished. He'd pushed her to this, forced her hand, and she'd shown her true face, a monster who'd burn a city to keep her throne. He stood, the motel's thin walls shaking as a train rumbled past, and felt the war shift, a brutal, all-out clash. He couldn't escape. Carver was cornered, but she was still swinging, and he was in her crosshairs, the stakes higher than ever. Should a man lose everything just for fighting the truth? Comment number 1 if you think Marcus deserves a break after this hell. Hit that like button if you're stunned by Carver's ruthless fire, and subscribe because this battle's about to ignite even hotter. What happens when the law itself turns into a weapon against him? Marcus Tate sat on the lumpy motel bed, the TV casting a flickering glow across the room, the image of his burning apartment building searing into his retinas. The acrid smell of smoke seemed to cling to him, even here, miles away, a phantom reminder of Judge Evelyn Carver's latest strike. His phone buzzed incessantly, texts from Keisha, Terrell, Jamal, all asking if he was alive, but he couldn't answer, his hands frozen around the USB drive that held his last scraps of evidence. The grand jury indictment for inciting violence hung over him like a noose, a lie spun by Carver's cronies to pin Atlanta's chaos on him, and now his home was ash, his family broken, his life a hunted shadow. He'd pushed her to the edge with Tanya's broadcast, the emails, the raids, but she'd pushed back harder, turning the law itself into a weapon. He rubbed his eyes, the graze on his arm throbbing under the bandage, and felt the weight of every loss, Malik's battered face, Lena's coma, the flames swallowing his past. But he wasn't done. He stood, the floor creaking under his weight, and grabbed his bag, the USB tucked inside. He had one play left, one chance to turn this nightmare around, and it started with his own trial. He drove to the courthouse the next morning, the city a war zone of shattered glass and graffiti, protesters clashing with cops in the distance. The borrowed car sputtered as he parked, his heart pounding, his jaw tight with a resolve that bordered on reckless. His trial was a circus, the courtroom packed with reporters, activists and gawkers, the air thick with sweat and tension. The prosecutor, a slick white guy named Paul Hensley, strutted in, his suit pristine, his grin a predator's baring of teeth. He painted Marcus as a rabble-rouser, a man who'd torched Atlanta with leaks and lies, and the jury, half white, half black, stared with mixed expressions, some cold, some curious. Marcus took the stand, his voice steady despite the exhaustion clawing at him, and told his story, the ledger, the car bomb, the sniper, the fire. Hensley scoffed. "You expect us to believe a judge orchestrated all this?" And Marcus didn't flinch. "I've got proof," he said, pulling out the USB. He'd saved one last card, a leaked audio from a grand jury insider, a juror named Carla who'd turned whistleblower after seeing Carver's allies stack the deck. He played it through a speaker, the room falling silent as voices crackled through, a juror saying, "She called in favors, said Tate's a threat to order." Another replying, "We'll bury him, don't worry." The gallery gasped, reporters scribbling furiously, and Hensley's face went pale, his objection drowned out by the uproar. Marcus locked eyes with the jury, his voice rising. "This isn't about me. It's about a system that protects her, not us." The judge, a stern black woman named Hargrove, banged her gavel, her face unreadable. But Marcus saw the shift, the doubt creeping into the juror's eyes. Hours later, after Hensley floundered through a weak rebuttal, the verdict came. Not guilty. The room erupted. Cheers from Keisha's crew, curses from Carver's old guard, and Marcus exhaled, his shoulders slumping as the weight lifted, if only for a moment. He was cleared, free to walk out, and he did, the sun blinding as he stepped onto the courthouse steps, the city's chaos a dull roar in his ears. Jamal met him there, clapping his back. "You beat him, man," and Marcus managed a tired smile, the first in days. He drove to the hospital needing to see Malik, to feel something solid amid the wreckage, and found the boy sitting up, sipping juice, his grin weak but real. "You're a badass, Uncle Marcus," Malik said, and Marcus laughed, a sound that felt foreign in his throat. He thought he'd turned a corner, thought he could breathe, but Carver wasn't finished. That night, as he left the hospital, the parking lot dark and quiet, a van screeched to a halt beside him, tires smoking on the asphalt. 4 men in ski masks leapt out, their boots thudding, and Marcus barely had time to react before they grabbed him, wrenching his arms behind his back. He fought, kicking and twisting, but a fist slammed into his gut, doubling him over, and they dragged him to the edge of the lot, the city's lights a blur. They threw him down, gravel tearing into his palms, and one knelt, ripping the USB from his pocket, crushing it under a heel. "You don't learn," the man growled, and Marcus recognized the voice, a cop he'd seen in Carver's courtroom, a loyal dog named Rollins. Before he could speak, they hauled Jamal out of the shadows, his hands bound, his face bloody from fresh cuts. Marcus's heart stopped, his breath catching as they dumped Jamal at his feet, a limp heap groaning in the dirt. A note fluttered down, landing beside him, scrawled in that familiar black ink. "Stop, or he dies." Rollins smirked, his mask pulled up just enough to show his teeth, and kicked Jamal hard in the ribs, a crack echoing in the night. "Next time it's you," he said, and the men piled back into the van, peeling out with a roar. Marcus crawled to Jamal, his hands shaking as he checked his pulse, faint but there, his friend's blood smearing his fingers. He fumbled for his phone, dialing 911, his voice raw as he shouted for help. Sirens wailed in the distance, but he knelt there, the gravel digging into his knees, Jamal's labored breathing, a knife in his chest. The trial win had cleared his name, given him a fleeting taste of freedom, but Carver had struck back with a savagery that dwarfed the sniper, the fire, everything. She'd taken his evidence, his home, his family's safety, and now Jamal, the man he'd fought to free, lay broken because of him. He'd thought he'd outsmarted her, thought that law would hold, but she'd turned it into a mockery, her goons a fist that kept swinging. Paramedics arrived, prying Jamal from his arms, and Marcus stood, his legs trembling, the note clutched in his fist. He'd reached his breaking point, every win snatched away, every step forward met with a blow that left him reeling. Rollins's words rang in his ears, a promise of more pain, and Marcus felt the war shift, a brutal stalemate where victory was a lie. He watched them load Jamal into the ambulance, the doors slamming shut, and knew he couldn't stop. Not yet. But the cost was tearing him apart. Carver was a hydra, her heads multiplying, and he was running out of ways to cut them off. Marcus Tate stood in the hospital parking lot, his knees raw from the gravel, his hands stained with Jamal Reed's blood as the ambulance sped away, its sirens slicing through the night. The note, "Stop or he dies," lay crumpled beside him, its black ink a taunt from Judge Evelyn Carver, a woman who'd turned his every victory into a wound. Jamal's groans echoed in his skull, the crack of Rollins's boot against his ribs a sound that wouldn't fade. His USB, his last piece of hard evidence, was dust under a thug's heel, and his chest heaved with a rage that felt like it could split him open. He'd cleared his name at trial, freed Jamal with the mistrial, but Carver had answered with a brutality that left his friend broken and his spirit teetering on the edge. He stumbled to his feet, the borrowed car's headlights, casting long shadows, and drove straight to the federal building, his mind a storm of desperation and defiance. He had one shot left, One final swing and it meant going all in. The ledger backup was still on his cloud drive, untouchable by her goons, and he'd deliver it himself, shove it down their throats until they couldn't ignore it. He parked. In the dim lot, the city's chaos a distant hum, and marched inside, his shoes echoing on the marble, his arms still throbbing from the sniper's graze. Agent Hargrove met him at the desk, his buzz cut sharp under the fluorescent glare, his eyes narrowing as Marcus slapped the printed ledger onto the counter. "This ends her," Marcus said, his voice a growl, "and you're taking it now." Hargrove flipped through it, his grunt softer this time, and nodded. "We've got enough," he said, and Marcus felt a flicker of something, not hope, but a grim satisfaction. He didn't wait for more, just turned and drove back to the courthouse, the morning sun rising over Atlanta's jagged skyline, a blood-red dawn that matched his mood. Carver's federal trial was in session, and he'd make sure she faced the reckoning she'd dodged too long. He slipped into the gallery, the room packed with suits and reporters, the air thick with tension. Jamal was stable. He'd learned from a quick call, but Lena and Malik were still trapped in their hospital beds, and that fueled him as he took a seat, his eyes locked on the bench. Carver sat at the defense table, her silver hair pulled tight, her face a mask of calm that cracked when she saw him. The judge, a grey-haired white man named Ellison, called a recess, and Marcus seized the moment. He strode to the FBI agents guarding the door, Hargrove among them, and whispered, "Now." They moved, a crisp, purposeful stride, and Marcus followed, his heart pounding as they reached Carver mid-trial. Hargrove flashed his badge, his voice cutting through the hum. "Evelyn Carver, you're under arrest," he said, and the room exploded, gasps and shouts ricocheting off the walls. She stood, her robe gone, just a tailored suit now, her eyes darting to Marcus as the cuffs snapped around her wrists. The click loud and final. He stepped forward, close enough to smell her perfume, and took the cuffs from Hargrove, locking them himself, his hands steady despite the tremor in his soul. Her wrists were thin, fragile under his grip, but her gaze was steel, boring into him with a hate that could have melted stone. "You think this is over?" she whispered, her breath hot against his ear, and he met her stare, his voice low. "For you it is." The gallery roared, reporters scrambling, cameras flashing, and Marcus savored her shock, the way her mask slipped as they pulled her away, her heels dragging on the marble. He'd orchestrated this, delivered the ledger. That sealed her fate, and for a moment he stood tall, the weight of weeks lifting, the taste of justice sharp on his tongue. He left the courthouse, the sun high now, the protesters cheering as news spread. Carver's done echoing through the streets. He drove to the hospital, needing to see Jamal, to tell Malik and Lena it was over. But the city felt wrong, too quiet beneath the celebration. He parked, his steps heavy, and checked his phone. A flood of texts from Keisha, Terrell, all triumphant. He was halfway to the entrance when the ground shook, a boom rolling through the air, deep and guttural. Like thunder too close, he spun, his eyes tracing a plume of smoke rising from downtown, black and thick, curling over the skyline. His phone buzzed, a news alert screaming, "Explosion at Grady Memorial Hospital." His heart stopped, his legs moving before his mind. Caught up, sprinting back to the car, the keys slipping in his sweaty hands. He floored it, weaving through traffic, horns blaring, the smoke growing thicker as he neared the hospital where Lena and Malik lay. The lot was chaos, ambulances screaming in, cops shouting, patients staggering out, their gowns flapping in the dew. Wind. He bolted inside, the air acrid with burning plastic and flesh, nurses yelling over the wail of alarms. The blast had hit the east wing, 3 floors up, and Marcus pushed through the crowd, his lungs burning, his eyes scanning for their rooms. A doctor grabbed him, her face streaked with soot. "Tate family's safe," she said, and he sagged. Relief flooding him, but she added, 5 nurses didn't make it. He stumbled to Lena's room, finding her still unconscious, Malik beside her, wide-eyed, clutching a blanket. "What happened?" Malik croaked, and Marcus couldn't answer, his throat tight. He stepped into the hall, the TV blaring alive. Feed, the anchor's voice shaking. "Bombing linked to Carver's arrest, sources say." His knees buckled, guilt crashing over him like a wave, the ledger's triumph turning to ash in his mouth. He'd cuffed her, watched her fall, But this was her final card, a blast that killed innocence to spite him. He sank against the wall, the tiles cold against his back, and saw a cop pick up a scrap of paper from the debris, the same black ink. "You did this." His hands shook, the note from Jamal's beating flashing in his mind. "Stop, or he dies." And now this, a massacre that pinned the blood on him. Carver's arrest was a win, a reckoning he'd fought for, but she'd struck back with a savagery that dwarfed every blow before, a bomb that shook the city and his soul. He'd thought he'd caged her, thought her whisper was empty, but she'd turned his victory into a graveyard, her last act a scream from behind bars. He stood, his legs trembling, and looked at Malik, then Lena, their safety a fragile thread in a tapestry of loss. The hospital buzzed around him, stretchers rolling past, sobs filling the air, and he knew this wasn't justice, it was chaos, a war he'd won on paper but lost in flesh. Carver was in cuffs, but her shadow loomed, a hydra with one head severed, and a dozen more snarling. He clenched his fists, the note falling to the floor, and felt the breaking point snap, his fight teetering on the edge of ruin. Marcus Tate stood in the hospital corridor, the air thick with the stench of charred metal and antiseptic, his ears ringing from the bomb's echo. The note, "You did this," lay at his feet, its black ink a brand that seared his soul. Judge. Evelyn Carver's parting shot from behind bars. 5 nurses were dead, their bodies still warm under sheets down the hall, and the guilt clawed at him, a beast he couldn't shake. He'd cuffed her himself, watched her dragged away mid-trial, thought he'd won, but the explosion at Grady Memorial had turned his victory into a slaughter. Lena and Malik were safe, a miracle in the chaos, but the city was a wound bleeding around him, sirens wailing, smoke choking the sky. He stumbled to a window, the glass cracked but holding, and saw Atlanta burning, protests flaring into riots, cars overturned, flames licking at storefronts. His phone buzzed, a news alert flashing. Tate blamed for hospital bombing, and his stomach twisted, bile rising in his throat. Carver's network had struck again, framing him for her last atrocity, twisting the narrative to paint him as the villain. He'd exposed her, brought her down, but her legacy was a hydra, its head snapping even as she sat in a cell. He grabbed his bag, the borrowed car keys jangling in his hand, and slipped out a side exit, the hospital swarming with cops and reporters he couldn't face. He drove to the motel off I-20, the neon sign flickering like a dying star. His mind, a storm of rage and despair. The room was a cave, the walls thin and stained, the TV blaring as he locked the door, his breath shallow. The news was a circus, anchors speculating. Was Tate the mastermind? While grainy footage of the bombing looped, the blast's orange flash a knife in his chest. He sank onto the bed, his hands trembling, and pulled out his laptop, the cracked screen glowing as he logged into his cloud drive. The ledger was gone, wiped by Carver's goons when they crushed the USB. But he had scraps, emails, audio clips, fragments he'd sent to Tanya. He pieced them together, his fingers flying, and found one last thread, a voicemail from a burner. Phone left days before the indictment. Carver's voice crackled through, smug and cold. "If they push, blow it all up, let Tate take the fall." His blood ran cold, the proof undeniable, her order to bomb the hospital a confession in her own words. He emailed it to Tanya, his message short. "Air this now." She did. By midnight, the broadcast hit, Tanya's gravelly voice narrating. The voicemail. Carver planned this, over footage of the hospital's smoking husk. The city erupted again, protesters flooding the streets, their chants shifting. "Carver's the killer," echoing through the night. Marcus watched from the motel, the TV's glow painting his face, a flicker of hope battling the guilt in his gut. He'd given them the truth, one last swing, but it wasn't enough to stop the tide. The next morning, he woke to pounding on. The door, his heart lurching as he grabbed a lamp, the only weapon in reach. He cracked the blinds, peering out, and saw cops, a dozen strong, their guns drawn, badges glinting in the dawn. "Marcus Tate, come out, hands up," a voice bellowed, and he froze, the room spinning. His phone buzzed, a text from Keisha. "They're saying you set the bomb, run." But there was nowhere to go. He dropped the lamp, his hands shaking. Anne stepped outside, the air biting his skin, his arms raised high. The lead cop, a hulking white guy with a scar across his cheek, smirked, his voice loud. "You're under arrest, Tate, for murder and terrorism." Marcus's knees buckled, but he stood tall, his voice steady. "You've got the wrong man," he said, and the cop laughed, cuffing him hard, the metal biting into his wrists. They shoved him into a squad car, the door slamming shut, and he saw the motel fade as they peeled out, the city a blur of smoke and rage. The precinct was a hive, cops buzzing, radios crackling, and they threw him into an interrogation room, the walls grey and cold, a single bulb swinging overhead. The scarred cop, Rollins again, sat across from him, his smirk wider now, the same thug who'd beaten Jamal. "You're done, Tate," he said, tossing a file on the table, photos of the bombing, fake evidence linking Marcus to explosives he'd never touched. "Carver's name's all over this," Marcus shot back, his voice raw, "and you know it." Rollins leaned in, his breath sour. "She's in cuffs, but we're her hands now," he whispered, and Marcus felt the truth sink in, a system so rotten it thrived even without her. Hours dragged by, questions hammering him, but he gave them nothing, his mind racing for an out. They locked him in a cell, the bars clanging shut, and he sat on the cot, his head in his hands, the voicemail replaying in his skull. Tanya's broadcast was out there, the truth was out there, but it hadn't saved him. The next day they hauled him to court, a rushed arraignment, the room half empty, the judge a Carver loyalist with a pinched face and cold eyes. "Marcus Tate, you're charged with 5 counts of murder," he droned, and Marcus pleaded not guilty, his voice echoing in the silence. Bail was denied and they dragged him back, the cell's dampness seeping into his bones. He sat there, the hours bleeding together, when a guard slipped him a note, unsigned, scrawled in black. "We're not done." His gut twisted. Carver's shadow stretching even from her cage, her network a machine that wouldn't stop. That night the TV in the common area blared, protesters clashing with riot police, Keisha's voice screaming through a megaphone, "Free Marcus!" But the cops pushed back, gas canisters hissing, bodies falling. Atlanta was a furnace, the voicemail fueling the flames, but Marcus was trapped, a fugitive in a cell. The law twisted to bury him. He paced, his shoes scuffing the concrete, and felt the fallout settle. A war he'd started now spiraling beyond his reach. He'd cuffed Carver, handed her to the feds, but her legacy fought on, framing him for her sins, the bomb a scar on his name. His family was safe, Jamal alive, but he was a ghost, hunted by the very system he'd tried to break. Rollins's words haunted him. "We're her hands," a promise of more pain, and Marcus knew the truth hadn't freed him, it had chained him tighter. He stopped pacing, leaning against the bars, the cold metal grounding him, and heard the chants outside, faint but fierce. He'd given them Carver's confession, but her empire struck back, a hydra with teeth in every shadow. The motel's thin walls had been his last refuge, now gone, and this cell was his new battlefield, a fight he couldn't win from inside. He clenched his fists, the note's weight in his pocket, and felt the war shift, a brutal dance where every step forward sank him deeper into her trap. Marcus Tate sat in the dim cell, the concrete walls slick with dampness, his breath fogging in the chill as the hours bled into days. The bars cast long shadows across the floor, a cage that held him tighter than the cuffs ever had, and the weight of Judge Evelyn Carver's final blow pressed down on him, a mountain he couldn't shift. He'd been framed for the hospital bombing, 5 counts of murder pinned on him by her network. The voicemail he'd sent Tanya, proving her guilt drowned out by the lies they'd woven. His hands were empty, the ledger gone, the USB crushed. His family safe but unreachable, Lena still in a coma, Malik healing but scarred, Jamal battered but alive. Atlanta raged outside, protests clashing with riot police. Keisha's voice a distant echo through the precinct's thick walls, but in here, he was alone, a fugitive in a system he'd fought to dismantle. His trial loomed, a death sentence, dressed up as justice, and the note, "We're not done," burned in his pocket, a promise from Carver's empire that this was only the beginning. He'd cuffed her, watched her fall, But her shadow stretched longer than he'd ever imagined, a hydra that thrived even with her behind bars. He paced the small space, his shoes scuffing the grit, his mind racing for an out. But the walls closed. In the air, stale with defeat. Then, on the third day, a guard banged on the bars, a wiry black man with tired eyes and a badge reading Owens, the same cop who'd bandaged his arm after the sniper attack. "Tate, you've got a hearing," he said, unlocking the cell with a clang, and Marcus stood, his legs stiff, his heart thudding with a mix of dread and defiance. They marched him through the precinct, past jeering cops who spat slurs under their breath, their loyalty to Carver a stench he couldn't escape, and into a squad car, the cuffs cold against his wrists. The drive was short, the courthouse looming. Through the morning fog, its steps empty now, the protesters pushed back by barricades and gas. Inside, the courtroom was a hollow shell, the gallery sparse, just a few reporters and a handful of suits, the air heavy with the musk of old wood and older lies. The judge was the same pinched-faced loyalist from the arraignment, his eyes glinting with a malice Marcus knew too well. But Marcus stood tall, his borrowed suit wrinkled but his spine straight. He'd surrendered, expecting death, the bombing. Charges a noose he couldn't slip, but he wasn't here to beg. He was here to fight one last time. The prosecutor, Paul Hensley, strutted in, his grin sharper now, his case a tower of fabricated evidence, bomb fragments found in Marcus's burned-out apartment, witnesses who swore they'd seen him near the hospital that night. Marcus listened, his fists clenched behind his back, the lies piling up like bricks. But he had one card left, a desperate play he'd whispered to Tanya before they'd locked him up. Get Carla, he'd told. Her, the grand jury whistleblower, and pray she'd come through. The judge droned through the charges, his voice a monotone death knell, and Hensley smirked, ready to seal the coffin, when the doors creaked open, a soft sound that cut through the room like a blade. Carla stepped in, her hair pulled tight, her hands clutching a recorder, her face pale but fierce. She walked to the bench, ignoring Hensley's sputtered objection, and handed it to Judge Ellison, her voice trembling but clear. "You need to hear this," she said, and Marcus held his breath, his pulse hammering as Ellison pressed play. Carver's voice crackled through, the same voicemail Marcus had found. "If they push, blow it all up. Let Tate take the fall." But it didn't stop there. A second clip followed, recorded days ago, smuggled from her cell, her tone smug. "They'll convict him, and I'll walk. The system's mine." The room froze, a silence so deep it swallowed every rustle, every breath, and Marcus saw the judge's face twitch, a crack in his mask. Hensley shouted, "This is inadmissible." But Ellison raised a hand, his eyes narrowing as he replayed it. Carver's confession ringing out again, a noose tightening around her own neck. Marcus stood still, his chest tight, the air electric with a shift he hadn't dared hope for. Ellison leaned back, his fingers steepled, and spoke, his voice low but firm. "In light of this evidence, the charges against Marcus Tate are dismissed." A murmur rippled through the room, reporters scribbling, and Marcus exhaled, his knees trembling. As the cuffs came off, the metal clattering to the floor. Hensley's face drained of color, his tower crumbling, and Marcus walked out, free. The sun blinding as he hit the steps, Keisha rushing to him, her arms fierce around his shoulders. "You did it," she whispered, and he nodded, the weight lifting, the truth finally cutting through, but it wasn't over. That afternoon, Carver's trial resumed, the voicemail the final nail, and Marcus watched from a hospital TV, Malik beside him, Lena stirring faintly in her bed. The verdict came fast. Guilty on all counts, bribery, obstruction, murder, life, without parole. The gallery cheered, Tanya's camera catching Carver's face, a mask of shock as they led her away, her silver hair dull under the lights. Marcus felt a rush, a bitter triumph, the Hydra's head severed at last. He left the hospital, the city quieter now, the riots fading, and drove to Jamal's place, finding him bruised but standing, his baby girl giggling in his arms. They shared a silent nod, a bond forged in blood and fire, and Marcus thought maybe, just maybe, he could rebuild. He rented a new apartment, a cramped box near Auburn Avenue, and started piecing his life back together, one case at a time, his name cleared, his fight remembered. Weeks later, he returned to the courthouse, a routine, hearing for a new client, the airlighter now, the portraits of dead judges staring down as always. He stepped into the courtroom, his red tie knotted tight, and froze. A new judge took the bench, young, white, her hair a sleek bob, her smile a razor's edge. She looked at him, her eyes glinting with something familiar, something cold, and banged her gavel, her voice smooth. "Good to see you, Mr. Tate," she said. And Marcus's gut twisted, a chill running down his spine. He knew that smirk, that tone, a shadow of Carver's venom. And as she leaned forward, her nameplate gleamed, Judge Abigail Holt. He'd heard whispers, a protégé, a student Carver had mentored in law school, groomed in her image. She flipped through her docket, her lips curling, and added, "You're next, Tate," so soft only he could hear. The room spun, the victory in his chest turning to ash, the cycle restarting before his eyes. He sat, his hands steady but his mind racing, the truth slamming home. Carver was gone, but her roots ran deep, a system that bred her kind, a hydra with new heads snapping at his heels. He'd won the battle, freed Jamal, cleared his name, avenged the dead. But the war wasn't over, it was reborn, and Abigail Holt was its face, a fresh predator on the bench. He met her gaze, his jaw tight, and knew this was no end, just a pause, a twist that promised more blood, more fire, more fight. The gavel banged again, the sound a gunshot in his ears, and Marcus braced himself, the reckoning complete, the future a storm he couldn't outrun. This story of Marcus Tate's relentless fight against Judge Evelyn Carver reveals profound truths about resilience, justice, and the cost of standing up to systemic racism. First, it shows that courage can topple even the most entrenched power. As Marcus's determination brought down a corrupt judge who thrived on prejudice for decades, his victories, from exposing her bribery to securing her arrest, prove that one voice, armed with truth, can shake a rotten foundation. Yet the tale also teaches a harsh lesson. Justice isn't a straight line. Every win Marcus claimed, the car bomb, the mistrial, the indictment, came with brutal retaliation. His family's blood, his home's ashes, a city's scars. It underscores that fighting racism often demands a price steeper than imagined, a sacrifice that tests the soul. Carver's fall, followed by Abigail Holt's rise, drives home the deepest truth: evil doesn't die easily. Racism isn't just one person, it's a hydra, a system that regenerates. And Marcus's triumph was a battle won, not the war. The lesson is clear: keep fighting, but know the beast grows new heads. What would you sacrifice to expose a racist tyrant like Carver? Comment below, hit like if Marcus's grit inspires you, subscribe for more raw tales of justice, and share to spread this reckoning. Thanks for joining this journey. May you find strength to face your own battles.